the hometown hero.
It's nice to be back.
It's very nice to have you here. It's great. And it's nice to have all of you. We can't really see you, but thank you for coming out, for forgoing the Halloween party and spending the evening with us. Much appreciated.
We'll try to say something scary.
Ooh. This is a scary time to a lot of people. We're just...
Here, President Trump. There you go. Boo, spooky.
You're famous, of course, for having coined new words, neologisms for politicians that you are not fond of. Santorum, which was wonderful. I was living in Pennsylvania when you came up with that. So
I hope you voted against him when you were living in Pennsylvania. Yes. Or I'll have to come up with a new name for you, too.
Yeah. Well, that could go, that's a double-edged sword. I take that. But I wonder, have you thought about any for this election? Is there anyone that you're
Well, everyone's been after me to redefine Trump.
Right.
And, after the success of Santorum, which was really like a lightning strike, and it wasn't my genius, a reader wrote in suggesting I host a campaign to come up with a new definition for Rick Santorum's last name, to tie him forever, not to his opposition to gay marriage. A lot of people on the right, and sometimes people on the left, will make this mistake and say, we redefined Rick Santorum's last name because he opposed same-sex marriage. Well, so did Barack Obama, so did Hillary Clinton back at that time, so did every Democrat in the Senate for the most part back at that time. If we were redefining last names based on just opposition to same-sex marriage, there would have been a lot of Democrats.
Congress would be a lot more fun.
Yeah, Congress, you couldn't watch the nightly news with your kids in the room, right?
Yeah.
It was because of his 2003 interview with the AP where he compared same-sex couples that wished to marry to child rapists and dog fuckers. And that was vile and offensive, and so a reader wrote in and said, as the scandal at that time was cresting and he was being welcomed back and forgiven, that he should never be able to run away from this, that it should haunt him for the rest of his life, what he said.
Right.
And that was a reader, and another reader came up with the new winning definition, the frothy mix of lube and fecal matter that is sometimes the byproduct of anal sex.
I love the sometimes in that sentence.
Thank you. It is the most important word in that whole sentence. Because if you're doing anal sex right, there's no Santorum. Because it only happens sometimes. And the readers of my column all voted on their top pick, and it was that one. There were other definitions that I thought were pretty good, including, when you go to the doctor for an STI check and they say, are you experiencing any pain or irritation or discharge upon urination? That's a really long sentence. What if the doctor said, Santorum? But the one that stuck was that, and it was really genius because it associated Rick Santorum with something that he objects to but is clearly obsessed about, which is gay sex, and the intricacies of it. And so people are always after me, like redefine, back in the day, back when he was still with us, Antonin Scalia's last name, Ann Coulter's last name, everybody who runs for office who's an awful Republican politician. And I'm a little opposed. I don't think we could do it. Like, I don't think lightning would strike again in the same way. But imagine if every time you had sex, you had to rattle off the names of every Republican member of Congress and Ann Coulter to make anything happen. It would disincentivize sex. But people wanted to come up with a new definition for Trump. And the difficulty with that is that Trump is already slang in the UK for audible fart. Is a Trump.
I had no idea. Where have I been?
And I think that's pretty genius. Short for trumpet. It's in the Oxford English Dictionary.
Wow.
So that's done. But I recently wrote a column where somebody came up with, I thought, a really great idea. In the way that African American parents have the talk with their kids about law enforcement and the disproportionate sort of bias and discrimination and violence they're going to face, and how they are forced by this culture to comport themselves differently than white kids, and they're held to a different standard, and it's called the talk. And this woman wrote in and suggested that women, in light of Trump's comments about sexually assaulting women, the talk that so many women have with their daughters about sexual violence, sexual assault, creepers on the bus, that should be called the Trump talk when we have that with our daughters.
I like it.
I like it too.
I like it.
And I wrote about it, or I ran her letter. Again, it was me just sort of shepherding my genius readers to the front of the queue to like have their say and trying to stay out of their way.
So, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to put this. You know, your column has done a lot to help us become more familiar with the range of sexual foibles or practices, you know, and the byproducts thereof, right? And you know, you've done a public service in that regard. We're going to talk about especially LGBTQ rights and what's happened in the last like 5 years, and sort of talk about that. But before we get there, I just wanted to ask you, and it has to do, I've been thinking a lot about Trump. Why, in the way that we've advanced to some extent around gay rights, we haven't advanced, despite your column, despite your brave work and all your readers, in sort of being sexually, I don't know if it's mature or just comfortable with sexuality, so that we can enjoy sex in ways that doesn't involve then, I mean, obviously harassing people in the workplace is about power. It's not about like, you know, but do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like, what's your take on that? It feels like we're not where we should be sexually as a nation.
Like we still struggle with sex negativity and shame.
Yeah, we don't have enough sex positivity, and we just, I mean, we have these really horrific kind of sexual practices.
Well, we could separate out into two things. There's sex negativity and shame that we all struggle with, and then there's the abuse of power, whether it's an intentional, malicious, or thoughtless, entitled abuse of power that comes into play, like in workplace sexual harassment. But I don't think we're ever going to eradicate entirely sex negativity, because it seems to be hardwired into the human experience in a way. You know, you think of when you first found out about sex, like you asked your parents where babies came from. When you were first having sex explained to you as a child, and your reaction was, that's disgusting, and I am never doing that. And adults are awful and icky, and I don't want them to touch me anymore. Because you just can't believe that people would do that, right? And then you hit puberty, and puberty's like, now your turn. You're going to do this thing that you never felt very comfortable about. So I think that discomfort is kind of because of our long childhoods, because of the way, how long it takes a human being to reach sexual maturity, and our culture and language and everything else, that moment of, holy shit, you're being drafted into this army that you never wanted to join, and you don't have any choice unless you're asexual, and then you win. You don't have to be drafted into that army.
Yeah.
So I just feel like
it's a kind of a chicken and an egg thing, though, right? Because your induction into sex, just understanding, is so awkwardly handled in most cases. Most people don't do that talk very well either.
I fucked it up.
Yeah.
I have a kid who's 18.
What happened? When did you have it, and what happened?
We had it with my son, the talk about sex when he was, you know, age appropriate. Where do babies come from? And we had to have a slightly different one because, you know, he didn't come from us. Mm-hmm. And we like laid it all out from, you know, human reproductive biology, which is usually what we call sex ed in high school, and it's terrible. But we did like reproductive biology, we did sex ed, and then like just a couple of years later, maybe when he was, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old, he walked into the kitchen one day and sat up on the counter and was glaring at me through narrowed eyes, and then I was like, DJ, what? He said, you and Daddy have sex for no reason. Two men can't make a baby. And I was like, oh, fuck. Well, DJ, 99.99999% of the sex people have is for fun. And for pleasure, and that's the kind of sex Daddy and I have 100% of the time. But the kind of sex straight people have only 99.9999% of the time. Because, you know, even the Santorums only have 7 children. Right. I think they've had sex more than 7 times. Sex does something else for humans around intimacy, pleasure, bonding, release. And that's really what sex is primarily about. And we don't tell kids that when we tell them where babies come from.
Yeah, that's true. Well, you know, that's dangerous territory, right?
Yeah, it is dangerous territory, because people think if you tell kids that sex is a thing that adults do mostly for fun, that they're going to want to do it.
Right.
And too soon. And that's not true. Like, there's all this research that shows that giving kids information about pleasure doesn't incentivize kids having sex any younger than they already do.
Yeah.
And withholding that information from kids. There was a study in the UK that found that all of these, particularly young women, were having sex that was uncomfortable and sometimes painful, and they didn't know, no one ever told them that sex is not supposed to feel bad.
Yeah.
Much less sex is supposed to feel good. So they weren't able to recognize that this was a bug in the sex that they were having, the discomfort, and not a feature of it.
Right.
Which they may have been able to get to on their own if somebody had given them a sex education that included what sex is mostly about, which is pleasure. I always compare sex ed as we have it, like our own conversations with our kids, sex ed in schools, to a driver's education class where all they teach you is how the internal combustion engine works, but not what a stop sign is, not what a turn signal is, not how the brakes work, just how the internal combustion engine works. And that's our sex ed class. It's how the reproductive internal combustion engine works.
It's the plumbing.
Right, but not a stop sign and how to recognize it, not what consent is, not what pleasure is, not what the real point of it is, not how to fuck, like how to drive. And if our driver's ed was like that, the first time anybody got in a car, they would die or kill someone. But that's our sex ed. Yeah. And then what happens the first time somebody has sex?
Yeah. What could we do to change that? I mean, obviously we know what the content should be, but how would you actually make it happen so that content could be made available to people at the appropriate time?
We would have to rewind the clock a few centuries, and instead of Canada getting the French, Australia getting the convicts, and us getting the Puritans, we would take the French and the convicts and give Canada and Australia the Puritans. So I despair of this and think this cannot be fixed.
Right.
And in addition to despairing about it, it's kind of a full employment program for me personally.
Right.
So I'm kind of for it.
So how did you know this could be your employment? Because I read the story of how you came to write an advice column that you were in the process of giving advice, so it kind of makes sense that you had a friend starting a newspaper and you said you should have an advice column about sex, and he said, well, you should write it. So how did you know that you could do that, other than being in the act of doing it?
I didn't know that I could do it, and if you read the first couple of years of the columns, which are locked away, it's clear that I couldn't do it. The first time I mentioned the clitoris, I put it in the wrong place. Turns out it's not on the soft palate, that's just where mine is. I was just projecting. If you look up advice in the dictionary, it says opinion about what could or should be done. Literally, the only qualification you need to write an advice column is somebody asked you for your opinion.
Right.
It's not, you need to have a degree in anything. I have a degree in theater from Champaign-Urbana, Krannert Center for the Performing Arts. But I have common sense, I guess. I grew up listening to my mother give advice. My mother was the Dr. Phil for the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I grew up reading Ann Landers and Abigail Van Buren in the Sun-Times and the Trib. And I also, when my brothers hit puberty and began to get Penthouse and Playboy, I would read the Playboy Advisor and Xaviera Hollander in Penthouse, who was the happy hooker who wrote a column called Ask the Madam.
Right.
That is, if you go back and find a few and read them, that's the spiritual mom of Savage Love.
Oh, wow, yeah. I've read those too. Yeah.
Nothing fazed her. She was down with whatever you wanted to do, so long as you did it in a way that you weren't hurting anybody else or hurting yourself to an unreasonable extent.
Right.
And she couldn't be shocked. And I really think that Xaviera Hollander and my mom are responsible for my career.
Did your mom know that she was the,
Oh yeah, I told her. And she agreed. And she said, yeah, you get paid to do what I did for free, and isn't that just how the world works with men and women? Right. Can I tell a funny story about my mom?
Please. Your mom, first of all, is to say your mom sounds like the best mom in the world.
She was wonderful.
Yeah.
And I miss her very much. She's been dead for 8 years now. She died right before she could have voted for Barack Obama, and she was very upset to go at that moment. And now, a dirty story about my mother. I was writing the column for years, and it had been widely syndicated, but it wasn't in the Reader in Chicago. And then the reader, which had flirted with picking me up, but thought I wrote too much about anal sex. So I was too dirty for Chicago.
This is the Midwest.
What?
This is the Midwest.
It is the Midwest, and you don't eat enough roughage, so anal sex is messier. Fiber, fiber, fiber. Fiber is Santorum repellent. So anyway, my column wasn't in Chicago for a very long time, and my mother worked at Loyola University, Catholic University in Rogers Park, near where we grew up, in the counseling center, and she had a staff that she managed, and all these student counselors and people in counseling that she tended to. And then I told her, oh, the reader's picking up my column, finally. And she was so excited, and she told everyone that, oh, the reader's gonna run Danny's column, it's starting this week, everybody pick up the reader, and she was getting everybody to go get the reader. And to the day she died, we had a conversation about it. Like, the day she died. She refused to believe that I didn't do this on purpose. And my only defense is I'm not organized enough to have done this on purpose, because this was a long time ago, and it wasn't just email to syndicate a column. Like, you went to a syndicate, and you had to write columns 3 weeks in advance. And she just didn't believe me that I didn't do this on purpose. I got a question that ran in the Reader the week my column first appeared in Chicago. And it was, what's the difference between a blowjob, cocksucking, and fellatio? Which is just a funny, cute, semantic question. And I wrote, and I know it by heart, blowjobs are what my sister gives, cocksucking is what my boyfriend does, fellatio is an act my mother occasionally performs. And the entire counseling department of Loyola University had been instructed by my mother to be sure to pick up this week's reader.
Just an accident, Mom. Mere fluke. Oh my God. Just a fluke. Just a fluke. That was like, oh my
I did
God.
not do it on purpose. I'm not that organized, Mom, wherever you are.
Your poor mother. Your poor mother.
But it's a good answer, isn't it? Like, it just shows that different people, the same sex act, different kinds of terminologies that they're comfortable with. And
right, right.
My sister wasn't upset.
Your mother was a Catholic, right? You were raised a Catholic. So is there anything in that upbringing that prepared you to be a sex advice columnist or to distinguish between blowjobs, fellatio, and cocksucking?
No. Thank God there are so many people who in their Catholic upbringing did have experiences that may have prepared them.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I meant.
Yeah, yeah. I meant more, I mean, I think that as I dig myself out of that horrible hole, I'll be interviewing Penn Jillette later in the week. Maybe he could make me disappear right now. What I was going to say is that, part of what is appealing about your column is that, as you say, like Xavier Hollander, you're sort of open to everything. And the mantra is giving good and game, and to try anything, but be decent to other people. And so I kind of thought, well, maybe there was something there in sort of your upbringing that allowed you that kind of...
you're right, there is, and it embarrasses me to say this.
Not the league of decency, but like the standards of decency that
I always tell, I'll go on right-wing Christian radio or be interviewed by somebody who objects to my column for every reason possible. And I tell them, if you put them all in a stock pot and boiled all my columns down to their essence, what you're left with is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. There's just more that can be done unto in my world than in your world. But it really is the golden rule here, where treat others as you would like to be treated, applies here. It's just that there's nothing wrong with these sex acts, so long as adults are engaging in them consensually and for pleasure, which is why adults have sex almost all of the time. Mm-hmm. And people shouldn't feel conflicted and shamed about that. I actually think being gay was a better preparation for me to write this column. When I started writing it, the joke was I was going to give sex advice as a gay guy to straight people. And it was going to be just for straight people. Right. And I was going to treat straight people who wrote me for advice with the same contempt that heterosexual advice columnists had always treated gay people with who had written to them. I grew up reading Ann Landers, and she grew and changed as they all did, and there was a process, right? But I grew up reading her, and when a gay subject or a gay question would come up, or in the Playboy Advisor, everywhere but Xavier Hollander, actually, there would be this, recoiling in disgust and then giving advice. And that was the shtick of the first couple years of Savage Love. I would say, ew, straight sex, how could you do something so disgusting? Your poor mother must be heartbroken. Here's some advice.
Right.
And straight people loved it because they'd never been treated that way before, and it was a hilarious joke. But then the column took off and became a real column. And what was, for me, the sort of revelation was how hard it was for straight people to tell truths about themselves and who they were sexually to their partners. Even the people that they were closest to, they'd married, that they were most in love with, how sort of bottled up and tormented by shame they were.
Yeah.
And, if you're gay, and I came out, rare for my generation of gay men, but I came out to my parents when I was still a teenager, or my mom when I was still a teenager. You're gay, you're Catholic, and you looked your parents in the eyes and said, I put penises in my mouth, I'm gay. That was hard to say. Then turning around and saying to your boyfriend, I want you to pee on me, is easy compared to telling your mother that you're a cocksucker. Telling the guy who sucks your cock anything else is easy. So for gay people, for straight people, those truths seem like mountains, like what I'm really interested in, who I really am sexually, which feels so difficult and hard to reveal. And for gay people, who I really am sexually beyond just the gay thing, those are molehills compared to coming out as gay to your family.
Right. Yeah.
And so I was just in this position to tell straight people, it'll be fine, it's okay, tell your truth. If they're not into it too, then they're probably not somebody you want to spend 60 years with. And tell your truth and be decent and kind and loving and solicitous of your partner's truth about who they are sexually and what they're interested in. And, I think straight people, even if they couldn't articulate it, straight readers intuited it. Because I had given myself permission to be gay, what wouldn't I give them permission to do?
Right. And you did give them that permission.
I did.
And
I
have
still
been
do.
for 25 years.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Did you ever think,
No. And now 8 years of the Savage Lovecast, where I can be a little bit more discursive and kinder, because you have more time to talk.
Yeah.
But I didn't think I'd be doing it for 25 years. I didn't think I'd be doing it for 2 years.
The way you describe it, it's almost, to me, and when we were talking before we met, I thought the same thing. It's like a kind of a radical form of empathy. That act of coming out and then and having to go through that and understanding what it is to be different. And so embracing difference in that way. It seems like that is a potentiality of coming out.
Yeah, you wish it was universally, it had that impact universally. You just have to get on any gay dating app for 2 minutes before you see the ad from somebody who says, no fats, no femmes, no Asians, just my preferences, and is being casually and cruelly, thoughtlessly, or even maliciously contemptuous of others and racist and shitty. So there's nothing about the gay experience that automatically makes people better people, but maybe it opens people up to being sensitized.
To the possibility.
Hopefully.
Yeah, but
unfortunately, there's always brand new awful gay people coming along. When it comes to the people who say those things, on dating apps that are racist and dismissive, people unlearn that in time. Somebody says that on their dating app, they get a lot of pushback. Mm-hmm. They make friends. Gay male couples are the likeliest of couples to be interracial. They make friends who have African American boyfriends or Asian boyfriends. They meet guys or they make friends who are African American, hopefully. And they unlearn that in time. They begin to see what's awful about that and they stop. But there's a new 18-year-old getting on the app tomorrow who just moved to Chicago from Kankakee who takes that guy's place. One guy stops being an asshole online and is replaced by a new guy being an asshole online. So there's this constant unlearning churn. Particularly, that problem is made more severe in a way because gay people clump up. They end up in urban areas, but they don't start in urban areas for the most part. And so, people arrive in Seattle, where I live every day, from Spokane, Washington, which is where my husband grew up, which is, you can smell the white supremacists over the border in Idaho. And we get, the young white gay boys who are fleeing Spokane for Seattle who, have never been challenged on their crap before.
They bring that with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it has to be unlearned in every sort of wave of gay boys coming to town.
When you started the column, you know, you had people address you as "dear faggot" or "hey faggot," "hey faggot," because you were sort of reclaiming, well, in part reclaiming that term, right? But it also set up that kind of tension if you were going to beat them down in a way. It's a good way to start it. But
and you know, part of it was, and this is for everyone here in Chicago, "Dear Abby, hey faggot." It had that same Chicago A, which is part of what I liked about it.
I get it. But you also identified as a queer nationalist.
My early column, I didn't actually write that. The editors of The Stranger at the time wrote that.
They put you in that box?
I was in Queer Nation.
Just like they did that thing with your mom in that first column in Chicago.
Yeah, they did that to me.
The editors.
I'm an innocent victim of everything that happens in my column. You know, I was in ACT UP, you know, very much into the whole Queer Nation project. And there was this debate about reclaiming hate terms, which meant not only using them ourselves, faggot, queer, dyke, sissy, but allowing straight people then to use them too. Otherwise, they hadn't been reclaimed. Otherwise, they were still hate terms.
Yeah.
So the column, for those 7 or 8 years when every letter began with "hey faggot," was demonstrating that this was a word that intent made it hateful, not necessarily just this arrangement of letters. Because people would write me and say, "hey faggot, I love you, I love your column. Here's my problem, help me out." And people would write me and say, "hey faggot, you're a disgusting sodomite, and you should be burnt at the stake, and fuck you, and gay sex is disgusting, and you're disgusting." And it just goes, you know, you knew that demonstrated in one column with those 2 letters ran together.
Yeah.
That word faggot wasn't all by itself dripping with poison and essentially to its core hateful. It was the person whose mouth or fingers it came out of that made it hateful.
So that was a period where people like you were reclaiming these terms, where we were having this conversation, and where it was about visibility, like becoming a nation of queers, or, you know, like that there were, and taking up public space and sort of turning discourses around. A lot of it had to do with activism around AIDS and the Reagan administration. But we're in a period like that now, you know, where there's a lot of kind of conversation about what are the terms that we're going to use to talk about ourselves. How do I want you to talk about me, and not just
a lot of policing of language.
Yeah, and not just me. What you're going to say about me, but what I'm going to say about you. So cisgender, or, you know what I mean? Like that, trying to make that like everybody is different, and the pressure's not on one person to bear the kind of term, right, that marks them as different. We're all different, and we shouldn't privilege one of those. So how do you navigate that now? What do you think about this period?
Oh my God, it's exhausting and impossible to navigate. Like that whole, like, in a way, the whole PC culture debate, and particularly the hothouse iteration of it in queer land, is designed to be unnavigable. It's designed to be a minefield that you cannot tiptoe across without stepping on something. Because the whole thing is set up to, you know, for the people who sit at home at night jacking off about their outrage and their wrongs. So I don't think it can be navigated. I don't think people should try. Like the whole idea behind Queer Nation and faggot, dyke, queer, sissy, and our hate word for straight people, which I popularized and was happy to use, which is breeder.
Breeders.
We had a hate word for you guys too, and it's a pretty good one. And people would always write in, and when I was using it a lot, and say, "I don't have kids. How does that make me a breeder?" It's like a piano can sit there with nobody playing. It's still a fucking piano. And the point of the whole Queer Nation idea, and I'm just, you know, I was a young radical queer then, now I'm an old fart gay man faggot, right? Was for people to say whatever they want and to use these words, and for them to be not hateful for intent to make them hateful, rather than going to people and saying, "You are not allowed to use that word, that is not your word." Then you just have to be the like language and thought police, and that's exhausting and also unproductive, because the people who will be, you know, who will listen to you and stop using whatever word that you've ordered them to stop, probably were using the word in an affectionate way or in a not too problematic way to begin with. The people who will not listen to you, who are going to go right on using the words because they're hateful shits, aren't going to stop because you fell on the floor. In fact, it incentivizes them using those words because you fell on the floor. I think of I forget which college it was, where people went out and chalked Trump on the sidewalks. And the university basically shut down and canceled classes for a day because everyone was so traumatized that the name of the Republican nominee had been written on a sidewalk, as if it's not all over the newspapers and on television. That was so traumatizing them they didn't feel safe. And I looked at that going, oh my God, you have just, anybody on that campus who's a troll or an asshole or doesn't have their paper finished now knows that to get a whole extra day to finish your paper,
right.
You just have to go write Trump on a sidewalk.
Right.
So I was, as a gay man, like, I didn't, I don't know, 15 years ago, David Spade was in trouble with GLAAD for making a joke in which he used faggot. I didn't have a problem with it, and I wrote something defending him.
Yeah.
Because I just think that wrestling with people about language, about the simple use of a word as opposed to what they said, what they were doing with it, what they meant, and the impact it had, instead of saying just hearing these two syllables is so shattering to me. Like, I just think that's pansy-assed, in a word.
There you go.
Because, my feeling when I heard the scandal about David Spade, and I smoke a lot of pot, so I can't remember exactly what it was he used faggot in a joke, and there was this GLAAD press release that came in onto my desk, and I was like, was it a funny joke? Like, doesn't the quality of the joke come into play? And was it a good joke? Were faggots a mention in the joke or the butt of the joke? Can we ever be the butt of the joke? Mm-hmm. It's got the word butt in it. You'd think we'd want it every once in a while.
So what do you think about, there was a big controversy here because the University of Chicago sent out this note saying that they were not going to have safe spaces or trigger warnings, and that kind of led to reaction from a lot of faculty saying, well, you're not going to tell me what I'm going to do in my classroom, and kind of this debate around that. What do you think about that?
I'm not a fan of trigger warnings. And I'm not a huge fan of safe spaces, depending on what you mean by safe spaces. Mm-hmm. There's some people who say a safe space is just an area on campus where people can take refuge. But there are people who also say, the entire campus itself should be a safe space. So these voices should be silenced, which has incentivized obnoxious trolls like Milo Yakovich, I can't say his last name. Because now they want to run onto campus and say the vilest things because they're not allowed to say anything. It's incentivized that kind of trolling. I don't actually write or talk about this much because I get into trouble, so I'm going to get into trouble. Yeah. My feeling about trigger warnings, though, is the people who use them don't need to, and the people who don't use them do. That someone who is sensitive enough to provide a trigger warning is probably going to discuss whatever the topic is with such sensitivity that they maybe needn't use a trigger warning. And the people who do need to use trigger warnings are the people who are going to talk about that topic with such insensitivity or such antagonism that their writing definitely needs a trigger warning, but it will never have one. And so trigger warning to me seems like a kind of virtue signaling. Like, I'm letting you know at the beginning of this piece that I'm a good and decent and sensitive person by putting a trigger warning here. Also, when you look at the science of trigger warnings, being protected from things that trigger or traumatize you actually makes PTSD worse over time, not better. That it's exposure that helps people recover from PTSD. I have no problem with a heads up. Terry Gross gives heads up on Fresh Air all the time. There's always this, we're going to talk about these things. Kevin, what's his name, hosts the Risk podcast. I love Risk. It's a terrific podcast. Kevin? Alison. Kevin Alison, he's great. I know him personally. I smoke a lot of pot. I forget last names. And on his podcast, they talk about anything, including sometimes stories about rape and sexual abuse. Last week's show had rape and domestic violence. And he has a way of saying, we're going to talk about these things. And it's a trigger warning for sure, but he does them in a sort of empowering way. But you read the stories, and some of them are overplayed by people on the right who want to make the left look foolish, about people asking for trigger warnings for Great Gatsby and for books that mention colonialism. And it just seems like incentivizing bedwetting and attention-seeking behaviors to a degree that's indefensible.
Yeah, I was going to college in the 90s, and there was this kind of conversation. People weren't using the term trigger warning, but I think the thing was there was a kind of blind spot, right? That people weren't even thinking about. So a rape scene in a film, for example, might require a a heads up, right? So there's a question of power there, that and sort of what makes one person uncomfortable, or even understanding what the range of experiences could be that could produce that kind of reaction.
But a
right,
part
to
of the
film.
debate about trigger warnings includes accommodations or opt-outs, as opposed to this course has difficult subject matter. Here's your trigger warning. If you can't handle this difficult subject matter, perhaps this course isn't for you. And perhaps you should take some other course, the Disney Overture, or however you say that word. Instead, what you get is like, I don't want to read that book. Provide me with some other book where I can do some sort of alternate course track or alternate syllabus in this class so I can still take this class. And that seems manipulative and controlling, as opposed to asking for a heads up that then you can brace yourself for, or read about the film instead of seeing the film if it's a film class. But there's a certain amount of the trigger warning stuff that seems like people going, you there, dance for me. It seems in some cases, and not all, which is what makes this so hard to talk about, getting in trouble. And I've encountered this myself speaking on college campuses. There does seem to be a certain degree and a certain small slice of nutty people who have weaponized their vulnerability. And it's about, as you said, power and control in disguise, in the drag of trauma. That's going to make me popular.
That is going to be the headline tomorrow, the drag of drama. Okay, let's talk about something far less complicated, but just sort of, I wanted to talk to you a bit about what's happened over the last 5 years. So we had.
Wait, can I interrupt? Full disclosure, like, my whole feelings about trigger warnings are complicated by the fact that there's a whole group of people out there who say that before you say my name, people should have a trigger warning. Because I am triggering. So how can I support trigger warnings as a trigger?
Right. And apologies for being derelict in my duties. We're not trigger warning Dan Savage. Defense, Don't Ask, Don't Tell goes away, DOMA gets overturned, we get marriage equality, and then gay adoption is legal in all 50 states. Stonewall is now a national monument, is going to be a national park, and that all happens in what, like
5-10 years.
5 years.
Huge...
like the actual acts, obviously not the building up to it.
Right.
So did you anticipate that the rapidness of all of that? Was it surprising, elating?
For 20 years I've used, I had been saying, so in a way I do think I anticipated it, that the gay rights movement, the LGBT civil rights movement, were two simultaneous kind of historic wars. There was a First World War, which was all trench warfare, and the lines were dug in and there was a lot of gas and the lines moved very slowly, if at all. But there was also at the same time a guerrilla war going on, a kind of Vietnam, where we were so far behind their lines, and that was the culture aspect of it, and the coming out aspect of it, and the family aspect of it. And I said then that these two wars were happening simultaneously, but the culture war, the guerrilla war, the Vietnam War going on at the same time as the First World War, that would one day lead to the collapse of those lines. And it was about people coming out. That's what made the difference for LGBT people, was coming out to our families. And initially, when the first wave of people began to come out, like 50 years ago, invariably people were rejected by their families. Their families were too embarrassed, and people were cut out of their families' lives. And to come out as gay or lesbian was to walk away from everyone you'd ever known and everyone you were related to, never likely to see any of them ever again. And that's what gradually began to shift until families were on our side. A couple of years ago, there was this lesbian high school student who wanted to take her girlfriend to prom in this small town in Mississippi, Constance McMillan. And the school, to prevent her from going to prom, which she had a legal right to do with her girlfriend, shut prom down. They canceled prom, which was a way of putting this girl in danger. Like, her classmates were angry at her for ruining prom, for getting prom canceled. The ACLU gets involved, I get involved, other people get involved. At every step of the way, her family was on her side. Her parents and siblings and extended family on her side. That's the difference now for queer people when they come out, is it seems as if our families are likelier to be on our side than not, and the majority are. And that's the most important sort of piece of the culture war that was going on behind the lines. Because you couldn't lie about us, all that gas in the air were the lies about us when people were getting to know us, or getting to know they knew us, because they always knew us. They just, in most cases, didn't know it.
Right.
So, we're randomly distributed throughout the population. If it was true of African Americans, that they were randomly distributed throughout the population, if that's how race worked, you found out if your kid was black at 14. And it's an imperfect analogy, I realize, in every way. George Zimmerman would be in jail.
Yeah.
We would have a very different culture around race than we do right now, because people aren't randomly distributed throughout the population. Not every family has people in it who are African American or a different racial minority. And that would change the conversation about race.
Right.
And maybe we'll get there as people continue to intermarry.
So what do you think hangs in the balance in this election, like looking at it from this point of view, from all that's been accomplished?
The future of the planet and the survival of humanity. I don't think it's overstatement to say that Trump is straight up a fascist. The violence at his rallies that he stokes, the attacks on the media and the free press, the threat to throw his political opponent into jail, he is straight up a fucking fascist. And if he gets elected, the powers of the presidency are immense and have grown over the last 50 years to an extent that if he gets elected president, the damage that he can do to our nation is going to make what George Bush managed to screw up in 8 years look like nothing. It could be the end of American democracy, and that's not hysteria. That's just a fact. And so, even if he loses, we still have to then confront the fact that he came pretty close to winning. And what does that mean? And who runs in 4 years? If you have Trumpism in 4 years without Trump, if you get a glad-handing, smiley, less rapey, less crazy demagogue in 4 years who can pick up the mantle and lead the GOP base, which is a mob of, it's depressing to contemplate, but it is what the GOP constructed. It is hilarious and terrifying and maddening to watch the GOP elite, the Mitch McConnells and the Paul Ryans, pretend that they're shocked that there was racism going on here in their party for 40 years. The best joke in the whole election cycle was on SNL with the guy playing Mitt Romney after Donald Trump said straight up racist things in the primary, and Mitt Romney was condemning Donald Trump, and they parodied him on Saturday Night Live by having Mitt Romney say, "Republicans do not say racist things. We imply them." And they do. Dog whistle politics. That famous Lee Atwater interview, deathbed interview, and I'm not going to try to paraphrase it, but everybody should go look it up, about why they shifted to talking about economics, to talking about welfare, to talking about food stamps. It was because they couldn't use the N-word anymore and win elections. But that's what all that talk means. It all means the N-word. And that's the Republican base. That's the mob they've assembled. They finally nominated one of their own. And they're going to do that again in the future.
That mob is us, though, right? I mean, those you were talking about.
I'm not in the GOP base.
Well, you may not be, baby, but there are a lot of people, right? And I mean, that what you were talking about earlier, that queers are like disseminated, or like, they're across the country, and so people have people in their family, and so you kind of come to accept this. That certainly hasn't been the case. That might be the case with people who have these different political views, but that ability to kind of transcend them and sort of say, well, you're my brother or my sister.
My dad.
Your dad. There's some really deep divides, and trenches. Like, we're back in trench warfare being dug between people, between family and
there
friends.
should be deep divides on this issue.
Yeah.
That someone supporting Trump, voting for Trump, is something that should estrange you from them in a severe and lasting way.
That's what people... Well, on that very uplifting note, let's turn it over to you.
I work primarily in a Q&A format, so.
Yes. Don't be shy.
Hi, Dan. I love your show. I'm so excited to see you.
Thanks.
I am a high school teacher in the suburbs, and I work for a school district that is involved in some legislation right now regarding a transgendered student. And so I guess my question is, how can I, as a teacher, be an ally to a transgender student when my governing body is not necessarily supporting that student?
I think you talk to that student directly. I think you stick up for that student in conversation with other students. I have a lot of teachers ask me, I can't get kids to stop saying gay as being lame or an insult, or just the homophobia and the transphobia, which has been the pivot, because the political right, organizations like the National Organization for Marriage, have shifted trying to get out of the homophobia business, and they're all going into the transphobia business. The backlash in the United States against the successes in the last 5 years, the remarkable successes of the LGBT civil rights movement, have been a shift to attacking trans people. And the trick and the solace for the queer students in that school is not, can one teacher sort of fix the school, fix the student body, get everybody to stop saying the word gay as an insult, get everyone to stop freaking out about the fact that there's a trans student. But if there's a teacher who pushes back publicly, that gives that queer kid in that school an idea of hope and justice. Like, the important thing for the gay kid who's still closeted in that room, when the teacher says, you all have to stop using gay as an insult, gay people are good and decent people, that's what that gay kid needed at that moment and got it. And the same goes for trans kids. The irony right now about the whole trans bathroom debate is we've heard all of these exact same things before. Everything the right is saying now about trans women being predators and going into the bathrooms and preying on girls, they said all of that about gay men. And eventually that lost its currency, but it took decades. It feels like this issue they're losing on in a matter of a few years as opposed to a few decades. So I have hope that we're reliving the same sort of demagogic horseshit that they threw at gay men, they're throwing at trans women, and rather than it taking 3 decades and a mass movement to turn it back, it's taking 3 years. In part because I think the media, with gay people, the media used to, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, would do stories on gay rights, gay people, with no gay people. No gay correspondence, no gay interview subjects. Gay people would be talked about, not talked with. And if you watch any of the media coverage of the trans bathroom debate, trans kids in high school, that debate, even I believe the trans kid in the school that you mentioned, they're there, they're on television, they're speaking for themselves. That the media got it finally with gay people, that you couldn't talk about us without talking to us. And we should be a part of that conversation. But that took decades to get there. And with the trans issue, it was instantly there. MSNBC, NBC knew that if they were inviting this bigot on from a Family Research Council to attract trans people, they were also going to have Jenny Boylan, who's the trans chair of the board of GLAAD, also a columnist for the New York Times, and I believe a professor at Yale and the author of like 4,000 books. And she's amazing. They had her on with that asshole. And it's harder to turn to someone and be an asshole to them when they're sitting there with you. And so, like, something that's accruing to the benefit of the trans rights movement and the trans community now is this sense memory, I think, in the media that was beaten into them about gay people, that you would be attacked if you talked about us without talking to us. And they're talking to trans people now. And so that's part of why I think it's falling apart so quickly.
Hello, Dan. Greetings from Kankakee. Years ago, you had to kind of bang on the door, be loud, be brash, be unyielding to get people to listen. Now the door's open, people are listening. Is that an obsolete sort of approach?
To be loud and brash and bang on the door? I don't think, when a lot of times when people would say these people are being loud and brash and banging on the door, they were just being themselves. They were perceived to be loud and brash and banging on the door by people who would prefer to live in a world where they didn't have to be aware that these other people existed. So it wasn't that they were banging on the door, it's that they were standing somewhere publicly being themselves. And people who prefer to not know about anyone who's different, particularly anyone who's different sexually, were disturbed by that. The banging was all in their heads, not anything that that person was necessarily doing. They were just being and being publicly themselves. But I think both have a place. There are still doors that are closed, particularly when you talk about diversity broadly and generally, not just about sexual minorities or gender. When you talk about it broadly, generally, there are still lots of closed doors that do need to be banged on and kicked in. And that was what Queer Nation was so good at, was banging on those doors and ACT UP.
We have one over here.
I have just two quick questions. Number one, given you've been doing this for 25 years, I'm wondering what you think your relevancy will be as you continue to age. And secondly...
That's like the best "when did you stop beating your wife" question I've ever gotten.
And secondly, there was a piece not long ago on This American Life with one of your former colleagues who was addressing your perceived bias against fat people, and I'm wondering if you could address that.
Yeah. I've been doing it for 25 years. I'll do it till I drop dead. I'm going to do the Ann Landers approach and have my column pried out of my cold, dead hands one day. Because it's a really sweet gig, and it's actually really fun to just sit in the morning and open the email and read all of these emails about people's sex lives, and to feel like people trust me with sometimes their real names and their work email addresses and these crazy stories. Lindy West was a writer at The Stranger for many years. I was never her editor, but I was one of the other writers there, an associate editor at the time. And we were writing and arguing a lot about the obesity epidemic in a way that I wasn't as respectful as I now know to be, in part thanks to Lindy West's writing. But we had disagreements about it, about how it should be discussed, and whether we should be more sensitive to this issue than we typically are at The Stranger, which is a rough and tumble, roundhouse swinging kind of place when it comes to writing, than we were on other subjects. So I think I shat the bed a little bit on that issue, and Lindy helped me see that, and I'm grateful to Lindy, as I said. Mistakes were made. We continue to learn and grow on all sorts of issues, myself included. It is weird now as a writer. You wrote columns and they disappeared, and if somebody wanted to read your 20-year-old columns, they had to go to a microfiche or a morgue, a newspaper morgue, and dig them up. And so there was this ability for writers' positions to change and grow over time, and for a writer to be perceived as having either grown or not holding a position. Now, with the internet and the publications, people will send out a link to something I wrote 20 years ago, and it'll be laid out and look like I wrote it this morning, with ads around it for things happening today, not ads for Bill Clinton's re-election campaign in '96, but for Hillary Clinton's campaign now. And it flattens out how a writer is perceived. And in a way, if you've been writing for a long time, you're not allowed to have gotten smarter about trans issues or the fat acceptance movement or anything else. You have people yelling at you as if you haven't learned anything for 20 years because you said this, that. And it's a really weird position for a writer to be in, particularly with writers who have long sort of piles of writing lying around that go back decades, because you're, I think, held to this unfair standard where someone who started writing yesterday knows what we all think now about X, and that's terrific. And we'll see how they're perceived 30 years from now, whether they're saying what now about X is actually on the nose or not. But yeah, I write differently about fat issues now than I did before Lindy and I argued with each other about it, and I thank Lindy for that. And she recognizes that. So mistakes were made. I put the clitoris in the soft palate. I haven't always been right about everything.
Back here.
Hey, Dan. I wanted to say also, just one of my proudest moments of seeing you is when you took on Ann Coulter on Bill Maher a few months ago. But my question is, how do you approach speaking to people like that who are just so hard and fast on these completely just not even in the ballpark of factual information, just these Trump supporters just make stuff up. How do you...
There's a thing you'll notice if you watch Ann Coulter, Kellyanne Conway, Ralph Reed from the whatever bigot organization he's heading up now. They do this thing where they don't stop talking. They interrupt and they keep talking. It's in the right-wing media training school. And that's the hardest thing to deal with, because you end up having to interrupt them and you look rude, but if anybody's keeping time, you know that that's the only way you're ever going to get a word in edgewise. That's the hardest thing, not having to talk to somebody who disagrees with you fundamentally, or talk to somebody who lives in sort of a fact-free bubble.
Yeah.
Those people are fun to tear apart on television, frankly. And I don't think, I was on TV a long time ago with Mike Huckabee, who's a despicable human being. And he doesn't think that gay people should marry. He doesn't think gay people should have children. We have children. And yet we were, on TV, shredding each other, arguing and fighting. But in the green room, just so kind and solicitous and affable. And we just had this moment where I said, I don't think you believe the things that you say. Because if you believe the things that you say about gay people, you couldn't be nice to me, ever. If I believed about gay people the things that you say about gay people, I wouldn't be nice to me as a gay person myself. Trying to destroy the family. I'm a big supporter of the family. If gay people are trying to destroy the family, destroy the country, destroy the planet, as Pat Robertson and the last pope argued, end humanity, if gay people are really out to do all of that, how can you chit-chat with me here by the bagels about our vacations? Like, you should be avoiding me. So, like, half the time, the people who say the worst shit on television, I don't think it doesn't mean that what they're saying on television isn't harmful and dangerous and poisonous, but half the time, I don't think that they believe it in their hearts. They're playing a role and cashing a check and ripping off the rubes who then do believe it and then vote for somebody like Donald Trump. It's maddening. And the media encourages it and stokes it.
Hi, Dan. I'm a marriage and family therapist in training, and I started listening to your column and your podcast as a way of gaining more comfort with speaking with my older clients about their sex lives. So thank you for all of your help with that.
You're welcome.
My question for you is, I have been having a lot of trouble recently with helping my clients with children confront the fact that their children may come out as LGBTQ sometime in their life. And there are a lot of faith-based things that they're working through. So I was just wondering if you could give me a little bit of advice as a therapist who has to maintain the therapeutic and ethical relationship with them.
See, I can be a little more direct because with my clients than you can probably be with your clients. I think bluntness is called for. A kid who's queer is 4 times likelier to attempt suicide. A kid who's queer, whose family is hostile, merely hostile, not violent, not throwing them out of the house, hostile, is at 8 times greater risk of suicide. No one has ever turned their queer kids straight by being shitty to them. People have killed their queer kids by being shitty to them. And I think that's what has to be emphasized to parents who, because of their faith, and I say this as someone whose parents, when I was young and gay, and they knew it before I knew it, they were doing the best they could with the information that they had available to them at the time, which was that gayness was something that little boys could drift into, and that if you nudged them in the other direction, they would drift away from dick, right? And so I had a lot of nudging from my parents that was really traumatic, that I remember to this day. I remember my dad talking in the car, the Chevy Nova with my parents smoking in the front seat with the windows rolled up in Chicago in February, and their 4 kids with no seatbelts rattling around the back seat, breathing smoke. And my siblings don't remember this, of course, but I remember my dad talking about how gay people were a threat to the economy because they didn't get married, didn't have kids, didn't buy cars and dishwashers and refrigerators. And of course, we didn't get married and have kids because we weren't allowed to, so it's kind of a catch-22, and fuck you, Dad, but still. And, they said sometimes these things in front of me on purpose because they thought it would nudge me away. Now they know better. I don't think my parents, being the people that they are, would do that now. But that was what they knew then. There's no excuse for these parents now. Knowing what we know now, it doesn't matter what you think Jesus thinks. And there are Christians out there like Matthew Vines. I would recommend the book God and the Gay Christian. Sometimes people have to hear it from somebody else who believes in invisible magic friends and not from sarcastic atheists. And I would recommend those, but sometimes it takes, and maybe it costs you a client, hopefully it wouldn't cost you a job. Sometimes it takes being brutal. And I'm end with a story about my mother, if that's okay. And this is about me sucking at my job, which sometimes I do. I had a radio show in Seattle. This was 24 years ago. I briefly had a radio show on terrestrial radio, and I got away with it somehow without an FCC charge. And some kid called in and wanted to come out to his parents, but didn't know if he should take the risk, 15 years old. And I asked him, what do you think your parents know? How do you dress in front of them? What do you say in front of them? Give me all this information. And I told him, your parents know you're gay. They're just waiting for you to tell them, so you should tell them. I'm sure they're going to be fine. And he calls back the next week to say, thanks, I told my parents, and my life is over, and they're going to drag me away from Seattle and move back to Arizona, and you've destroyed my life. Thank you very much. And I got him off the air, and I said, what's your mother's phone number? Give me your mom's phone number. And I had my mom call his mom. Which she was happy to do. And my mom said to his mom, this kid, Jason, he's now almost 36, 37 years old, now one of our closest friends. We're still in touch. My mom said to Jason's mom, he's 15 years old. And this was, 24 years ago. He's 15 years old. If what you want is your kid to, no, he must be 39 now, Jesus Christ. If what you want is your son, your 15-year-old kid, to run away from home, to engage in survival prostitution, to live on the streets, to contract HIV and be dead by 20, you keep it up, lady, because that's what you're going to get. If that's what you want, this is exactly what you should do. And my mother, she was Catholic. She just slipped the knife in between this poor woman's ribs and cut her open, but restarted her heart, too, somehow, at the same time, and helped this woman by being brutal see that their disapproval and their Jesus fixation was only going to destroy their kid. And they needed to let that go. They had to pick between their kid and this iteration of their faith, which is a choice. I love religious people running around saying that sexuality is a choice, as if that proves that there's something wrong with it, when they're all also proselytizing and trying to get people to choose different religions all the fucking time. But anyway, where was I going with that?
They've kicked in.
I had a point, but I can't remember what it was. Marijuana is legal now in Washington State, where I come from.
Can I ask you, those were great questions, thank you all, but before you go, and this has been a lot of fun, you became one of the trusted voices in the United States, right, on all sorts of issues, and I wonder, at this point, look, he's looking really who do you recommend that we look to, who are the emerging LGBTQ activists that you think are doing really interesting things and are kind of carrying things forward?
I would recommend Matthew Vines, and then there are great bloggers out there, but some of them are old farty fags like me, like Joe Jervis and Michelangelo Signorelli. They're just I couldn't say.
Okay, I wasn't trying to say you were an old.
No, but I am.
Fag. I mean.
I said it.
Yeah, I know, but
But the young queer writers that you should be reading.
Just anyone you're excited about that. Maybe
I'm
we
only
should keep
excited
an
about
eye out.
old people.
Are you going to start writing about seniors? I know you do give advice to sexagenarians, but...
I do, and Joan Price. Joan Price is my go-to expert on senior sex. And she tells me I'll be having it soon, and then I cry.
Yeah. Dan Savage, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.